Hi, this is Len Edgerly. Welcome to the Kindle Chronicles. Today is Friday the 13th, November 13th, and I'm coming to you from Cambridge, Massachusetts. We are in the midst of a reshuffle of our planned trip to Florida, and actually we're leaving tomorrow instead of 10 days from now, which was the original plan, so the last couple of days have been pretty hectic, and as a result I'm going to put this episode up with my interview with Kevin Kelly, but no time to put together news, tech tips, some of the other things that usually go with the show. How this started was I've been watching the numbers, the COVID caseload around the country, and I saw on one map that there were a lot of red states, including Massachusetts and some of the states we'll be driving through, that were marked red, and the advice for public health officials in those states was to issue stay-at-home orders. So that made me think that things are changing, and naturally I reached out to Jerry Riddle, who has been on the show several times throughout the pandemic, giving his advice on what's ahead, what's coming, and how to handle it. I wrote Jerry yesterday. I said, I'm watching the COVID numbers and wondering about our plan to drive to Sanibel arriving November 30th. It's still safer than flying, right? I'm also thinking it might make sense to drive straight through without stopping to visit you and a couple of other friends that I'd like to see in masked outdoor 6-foot visits, just safe hotels and driving straight. Or cancel the trip. Your thoughts. Hope you're well, Len. Jerry quickly wrote back, and I read his email to Darlene. He said, "Hi, Len, I'm glad you emailed me. That is a really tough call. I am watching the stats and am horrified. I think if you decide to make the trip, I would drive instead of flying and make the absolute smallest number of stops. The amount of virus circulating during the Thanksgiving week is going to be off the charts. Frankly, driving before the week of Thanksgiving would be far better. Traveling the week after Thanksgiving would be a second choice, but many more will be infected by that point. Buying food where you are or packing meals would be ideal. In my mind, the considerations are, number one, choose whichever place, Sanibel or Maine, has a population that takes the virus and precautions seriously, i.e. the people around you and their diligence is likely the number one factor in preventing you from being infected. Number two, choose whichever place has the best healthcare facilities and capacity. All things being equal, Sanibel is better than Maine for pure physical health considerations, vitamin D and sunlight, and a warmer, more humid climate will potentially dampen the spread of any airborne virus. Hope this helps. Let me know if you need anything. A couple of things. I thought it was interesting to think about, if we could go either place. At this point, we've rented places to stay in Sanibel until April 1st, so we're kind of committed there. But I like seeing that there are some similarities, because in Sanibel, from what we've heard, once you drive onto the island from Fort Myers, there is a mask requirement under Florida state statutes, or the governor's way of handling things. There's no penalties, but the town itself is really taking the pandemic seriously. And from what we've heard from realtors and people we've talked to down there, that most of the people are wearing masks. So I feel like it's a community that is taking it seriously. I also got a list of hospitals in the Fort Myers area, so we'll know where to go if we need it. Hopefully we won't. And I think we will enjoy the vitamin D and the sunlight, and having an environment where perhaps the virus isn't quite as happy as it would be in the north during the winter. My first reaction to Jerry's email was, let's just leave tomorrow. And pretty quickly it became evident that wasn't going to be possible. So I compromised and said, let's leave Saturday, do an extra day. And we've been just out straight doing things to get ready for the trip. And I'm glad I didn't leave yesterday, because I'd forgotten I'd ordered an iPhone 12 Pro Max, and it arrived today. So at some point in the next few days on the trip, I'll have some fun putting that together. So, if all goes well, I'll be coming to you from Sanibel Island for next week's show. Maybe there'll be some recording that Darlene and I will do on the way to give you a taste of the trip. And it'll be interesting here I am in Cambridge, kind of chilly, dark, gray, and a week from today, a completely different part of the country. We're pretty excited about it. So let's jump straight to the interview. Kevin Kelly co-founded Wired magazine in 1993 and served as its executive editor for its first 7 years. His current title at Wired is a great one, Senior Maverick. He is also founding editor and co-publisher of the Cool Tools website, which has been reviewing tools daily since 2003. From 1984 to 1990, Kelly was publisher and editor of the iconic Whole Earth Review, a journal of unorthodox technical news. He co-founded the ongoing Hackers Conference and was involved with the launch of The Well, a pioneering online service that was started in 1985. Kevin's most recent book, published in 2016, was The Inevitable: Understanding the 12 Technological Forces That Will Shape Our Future. That was a New York Times and Wall Street Journal bestseller. His other books include New Rules for the New Economy in 1998, Out of Control, The New Biology of Machines, Social Systems, and the Economic World in 1992, The Silver Cord, which is a graphic novel about robots and angels, published in 2015, and Cool Tools, an oversized catalog of the best tools in the universe. Oh, and also What Technology Wants in 2011. Kevin is also co-creator of a terrific weekly email newsletter that I subscribe to named Recomendo. It comes every Sunday, and it was launched shortly before I last had Kevin on the show in 2017. We connected between Ocean Park, Maine and the San Francisco area on November 3rd, 2020. At the time, I was in the middle of a 6-hour shift of serving as a phone bank captain, making calls for the Biden and Hickenlooper campaign into Colorado. So I took a brief, I told the tech person with me in the Zoom room, I need to just take a half an hour to talk to a guy for my podcast, and jumped into Kevin, and then I was rather abruptly had to end the interview because they were calling me into another Zoom room for the team of volunteer leaders to get together and plan it. So I was kind of juggling two worlds, and it struck me that it was appropriate because as Kevin talks about what's the future look like, this whole business of being part of a virtual campaign, which Darlene and I did from Maine, here we are working with a team of people, and you'll hear him talk about this in the conversation. Some of them were in Colorado. Some of us were on the coast of Maine. One of the leaders was in Nashville, and yet we're all working together each day for long shifts, making, turns out to be millions of phone calls to Colorado during that campaign. And it was a unique experience. So in the midst of it, I had a chance to talk to Kevin Kelly about the future, and that turned out to be pretty good. So here is our conversation from November 3rd, 2020. Last time we spoke, it was 2017. I think Recomendo was fairly new at that time, but you did have 11,000 subscribers, and you've tripled that. You're up over 37,000. I'm curious what.
No, I think we're closer to almost 50,000 now.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah.
Man, that's fantastic, and it's every week. It's quite a labor of love, I can tell. Have you changed the mission of it from when you started, having done it that long and getting feedback from people? How do you see what you're doing now compared with when you started 3 years ago?
That's a good question. We haven't really. It's a simple enough and broad enough mandate that we haven't really pivoted. We haven't done a pivot. It's just, three of us, two items, two things that we want to recommend. And, I think we have phases where we might have more toolless things sometimes, and then we might go to more intangible things, people to follow. We kind of have to remind each other sometimes about how broad we are. But I think in general, it's working. It's one of those kinds of things we wish maybe more people knew about it, because there's no more work for us to do, and we really feel like, hey, more people could really be enjoying this. We are doing a second book, the best of Recomendo, the expanded version of the 4 years almost of stuff that we've gathered. And that's coming out this Christmas. Oh. It's a on-demand published book, taking advantage of Amazon's remarkable machine for making on-demand books, which are indistinguishable from a regular book. In fact, most books are printed on demand, and so that's and the one, I guess, to answer your question, what we have started to do is we have done a video version of Recomendo, called Recomendo Shorts, and we're trying to do that every 2 weeks, where we do one little, 2-minute video with our phones of something we recommend, a little bit more visual. So that is part of my agenda, which is what I'm calling video first. It's in recognition that the center of culture has shifted away from text and books of any sort onto the screens. And that my kids, their friends, don't read books. They're not just not reading my books, they're not reading books in general. They're spending their time watching YouTube, which is what I'm doing with my free time. And so I want to be there. We want to be there. It's not a blog, really, or books or writing. It's video. Video is the center of the culture, moving images in time. And so we're trying to, or I'm trying to make that migration over, because for 50 years or more, I've had a still camera inside my head and a machine that thinks in text. And retraining myself to think in terms of moving images in time, in space, is a big thing. And I have to kind of work at that.
That's fascinating. It's just a whole new mode of creation. Are you becoming aware of the difference that makes if you have a kernel of an idea in the middle of the night and you were to sit down and write it out in words versus a kernel of that same idea and you're going to put it in a video? Is there a difference in the actual creation process and therefore in what the audience perceives? It seems like there's some pretty fundamental stuff going on when you shift.
The one good thing in my favor is I've always been a very visual thinker. And so when I'm falling asleep at night, I am thinking of things that that I want to make and stuff, and it's all very visual. So I, even when I was writing, I would do a lot of diagramming and doodling and stuff, trying to understand something to write it. But those images, by and large, have been more static. And so what I'm trying to do is to kind of move into this world where they move through space and time, which is the kinetic aspect of it. Yeah. Like I was just describing, my newest tool acquisition was a 3D printer. It turns out that, printing things is and keeping it running is a chore in itself, but it's a minor chore compared to where you spend most of your time is working with 3D files. These files that produced in like Tinkercad or SketchUp or Fusion 360, in order to print something, you have to become very adept at 3D files, and that's a whole. I mean, I can kind of barely get through Photoshop, which is layers, but it's 2D, and I get that. But this is like 3D spatial. There's whole new metaphors. Once you get into like things that get into Unity, where there are game engines, this is a very different skill set, and I am not at ease yet in that. I'm just kind of at the beginner's mind in trying to get used to these metaphors and to these organizing principles and all the other skills you need just to navigate through and understand how things fit together.
You had a mention, and I think it was last week's Recomendo, of a TED Talk that I watched by Bill Burnett from the Stanford Design School about using design thinking not just to build a city or a product, but to actually apply to your own life.
Right.
And it seemed like you were making a reference to it. Are you in the midst of a redesign for your life as you approach the end of your seventh decade?
Yes, I should be. It's not a bad idea. No, I'm very blessed and lucky beyond belief in my life, and I have very few regrets. But like everybody else, I'm wondering what I'm going to do when I grow up. I have the privilege of kind of deciding what I want to do with my day and how to spend it. And so I've decided I want to become a YouTube star. I want to be on YouTube. I want to move to this new media, and I want to get proficient at it. And so in the sense that part of design thinking is being deliberate. I am a very deliberate person, and so I'm trying to make that move. The other principles of design thinking, of making sure you're working on the right problem, defining the problem, all the steps that Bill went through, are just things that I do, in a kind of I wouldn't say naturally, but things I've been doing for a very long time, and I do them kind of habitually. So assessing, I do examine my life a lot, and that's part of this process of iterating. Mm-hmm. So the part of the design approach to life is you do things through iteration. Mm-hmm. You expect things to fail at first, or you don't. You expect to have to redo them. First drafts of things, prototypes. So I do a lot of that. I'm doing things that I know I may not be happy with later on, but that's okay. This is the necessary first step. And so yes, but I'm not doing a major redesign. My logo is still the same. I guess that's a good, that's a good indication.
There was one bit in the TED Talk which I liked. I guess part of his process, or one of the tools, is asking, what would you do if you knew no one would laugh? And
right.
I could imagine, I'm a little older than you, but to boldly say I want to be a YouTube star. How about do you want to be a TikTok star as well? Or
No. TikTok's my limit there. Part of the thing is I'm not a phone person. I'm still very desktop oriented. That would be a real switch for me. And the thing about YouTube is it works on the desktop. Huh. TikTok doesn't really work. You really need to be phone centric for that to really work. I think one of the reasons why I am not very bothered by social media is I don't have social media on my phone. First of all, it's mostly just a publishing media for me, but I always approach it on a desktop. So I don't have the little Pavlovian, I don't have those habits because desktop doesn't seem to enculture that as much.
Yeah, for sure. One of the things you said 3 years ago that I've enjoyed recalling and trying out in my own life is you said that you were trying to enjoy changing your mind more.
Right.
And I wondered if, flash forward to 2020, can you think of one thing that you've changed your mind on that's been most significant this year?
Well, it wasn't this year, but I changed my mind about cannibalism. I'm all for it.
You're all for it. Okay, this needs to be discussed further.
I don't see what's wrong with eating human flesh if the person is dead. It's a weird thing, particularly if you're in a survival situation. I would have no hesitancy about eating a person who had died if I was starving, and I would hope that someone would eat me if it would help them. And so there are people who eat placenta, which is basically, as far as I can tell, cannibalism. And I think the prohibition is just kind of weird and superstitious. So, the person's dead. Now, I'm not for killing people to eat them, but if someone died, I don't eat mammals anymore. I haven't eaten mammals for 17 years. So I'm not probably going to eat human, but I don't see, I don't see much difference between, I don't eat the mammals because we were killing them to eat them. If I was starving, I would absolutely eat a mammal. And I would eat you. So just warning you.
That's comforting. Well, I think I'd be glad to return the favor. I mean, if we were in a plane crash, that famous Andy's plane crash, but a lot of that story was the agony of deciding to do it. But you and I think you've convinced me, would say, well, okay, it's time to eat Fred. He's gone, and we're hungry.
Yeah.
So
what's the big deal? Why not? That's just so weird.
Well, it's funny too, because when you think of the cultural aspect of it, in the Catholic Mass, we're eating the body and blood of Christ. So why isn't that taboo?
That was the argument that won that plane over.
Oh, really?
It was the Eucharist. Yeah.
Oh my gosh! Wow.
Yeah.
Well, that's good to know. So I'll have to say I didn't see that one coming. That's fabulous. Well, now what about COVID-19? I mean, your brand, or what you've brought to so much of your work, is the future. You help people you're sort of testing out the future. Is there anything about the COVID-19 experience so far that has taught you something about the future, or revealed something that you can see coming now more clearly than before we had this experience?
Yeah, that's a really great question. I would say, first of all, I think we're still 2 years. We have another 2 years of the COVID, of this particular virus, of restrictions of some sort or other, whether it's masks or social distancing in restaurants, whatever. I think it's going to be a long tail of doing this. And I think the thing that is really evident now is that modern urbanity, one of the prices is a susceptibility to viruses, in particular diseases, contagious diseases, and that we will the collectively humans, societies, will have to gear up for these, and we'll begin to examine things like the flu and colds as whether those are acceptable. In other words, like, the question that will come before us is, if we could, I don't know how many people die. There's some hundreds of thousands of people die of the flu every year in the U.S. If we could stop that by having these social distances, would we do that just for the flu? If not, why not? And, part of the reason is, we can have some vaccines for flus, and so in theory you shouldn't need that. And so will vaccines become more mandatory? So I think the short answer, I don't know the answers to these, but I think what we'll see is we're going to see a kind of dealing with virus as part of the infrastructure, as much more part of our lives. And even if another kind of rogue virus doesn't come up, there are still plenty of things like common colds and the flu, which will get far more attention, and not just in terms of having vaccines, but just in terms of covering our noses and all that kind of stuff. So I think it will change the system for a while. I don't know what the long term was. Very obvious we need to have better ubiquitous testing. So testing and vaccines seem to be one of the ways that you would deal with this in a kind of a scientific way. And those both require kind of participation, and here's the thing, of everybody.
Yeah.
So it's not just those who can afford it. It's like, in order for this to work, even people who can't afford it have to be included. And so it could be that this might provoke a much more of a kind of universal health care attitude of saying, if the guys in the homeless shelters don't also get this, we're not going to succeed. They're part of the solution. So I don't know what those remedies and solutions will look like, but I think there will be a permanent alteration of what it's like to be modern in a city, and accounting for the fact that you become a hotbed for transmission of viruses of all sorts, including ones we know about and ones we don't know about, that might move us towards universal health care.
We've got a condo in downtown Denver we're trying to sell, sort of readjusting our lives. And the realtor told me downtown Denver's market, we're calling it a donut because properties are not selling. We're in a high rise, so you've got to use the elevator to get up and down. The market around Denver is hot, hot, hot. You put a property, it gets sold within 2 or 3 days. I could imagine that that's a situation that won't go away even in 2 years if there's a vaccine, that this readjustment of how we work and where we work and the need to be in cities, but also cities are so cool. So the idea that Denver would somehow be hollowed out, it's such a vibrant, wonderful city, but do you get any glimpses of the future on how this aligns cities versus people not living in cities? Yeah.
I think the advantages of the serendipity and the interactions of cities, I just don't see going away.
Yeah.
The question that I always ask these days that we can ask finally is, well, that may be true in the U.S., but how about the rest of the world? Because the U.S. is increasingly a smaller part of the world. Are we seeing the same kind of dynamics in China, say, or India or Europe? And I don't think we are. So I think people in the U.S. tend to confuse what's happening in the U.S. as meaning this is happening in the world.
Right.
And part of what we're going to wake up to, we being Americans are going to wake up to in the coming decade, is that that's not the case. Increasingly, what matters is what happens in Asia, not just in terms of the math and the numbers, but I think K-pop is just one little example of how Asia is going to become much more of a culture leader.
And that's a music style that I've
K-pop
heard.
Is a music style.
I don't know what K-pop is. I've heard of it. I know
Korean
what you know.
K-pop comes from Korea. It's one of the big exports of Korea. Is a style of music maybe on par with hip-hop in terms of kind of global influence.
Yeah.
And you've heard of hip-hop, right?
Yes, I have.
Okay, so
let's just find out how ignorant I am here.
It's right. China will soon invent a product that will be world class in its design and craftsmanship and desirability, and everybody in the world will want one and buy one. And that'll happen within the next decade. And that'll kind of like, just as Japan, when I grew up in the 50s and 60s, Japan was a code word for crap made in Japan. Mm-hmm. It was like what they call Chinesium these days. They call it, it's China has a reputation for making the low end stuff, but that's Japan now. It's like, made in Japan. Okay, that's like the best stuff. Well, China's going to do the same shift, where made in China will be the best stuff that you can buy.
Wow.
So I don't know. Back to the COVID. So what we want to look at in terms of paths or patterns of people's living is the whole world's more and more going urban. I think that's a general trend that's not going to be stopped by COVID. It might temporarily pause it at the most, but I think this idea of working remote is an attitude and a stance that people will work remote even when they're working in the same office. That the tools that we're developing of collaboration at a distance will be employed even if you're working in the same building. And what Zoom and Skype and these primitive, crude things right now, they're like the early bulletin boards in the 1980s. We see how primitive they are, but we also realize the potential that they are suggesting. And the teleconferencing tools are small, haven't really advanced that much in 10 or 15 years. So I feel like I've been doing this for a decade. But now the rest of the world who didn't have any exposure to it, they have been forced to, and now they see, oh my gosh, this works. Yeah, we know that we've been using it for a decade or more, but we're not at the point where we can now take the next iterations and next revs of these and go forward. And for me, the class of this is not so much even video conferencing. The class is collaboration tools. Mm-hmm. Tools that will allow us to collaborate in scales and distances that we could not before. And, Slack and these other things are kind of, again, just hints at what we might be able to do and how we could do this where, you could be collaborating with 1 million people working on a project together around the world. And some of those millions of people may be sitting next to you, but you'll be using these collaboration tools.
Yeah, it'd just be kind of a coincidence if they happen to be sitting next to you than a necessity.
Right. Exactly.
Well, I'd like to finish up with the Mirrorworld. I read the article you wrote back in 2019. AR will spark the next big tech platform, call it Mirrorworld. A couple of questions. Since then, you mentioned Pokemon Go as kind of an early, crude inkling of what this might look like. Right. There's a digital twin to everything in the real world. What have you seen this year that kind of confirms that we're on that path? And then the other question I have is, do you detect anything in Amazon's current strategies or alignments that make you wonder if Bezos would like to do for Mirrorworld what he's done so far to the web and social media, that one of these huge corporate entities that defines that new space might even be Amazon?
Yeah, so let me answer the second question first. I don't have I've seen nothing from Amazon that suggests to me that they're going full hog into this, but all the other big tech giants are, and history would suggest that absolutely none of them will be the ones to dominate. I mean, if you look at the pattern in the last 100 years, certainly the last 50 years, the pattern is that the one that comes to dominate the new pattern is coming from outside. They're always the pirate. They're always the outsider coming from a different industry somewhere, or a different field. So Google and Microsoft and Amazon all have fabulous arguments about why they will be the ones to dominate. But history would suggest they're absolutely wrong, and it's going to be an upstart who has no legacy to protect, has no resources to purchase the solutions, so they have to invent them, and have no bias, or not shaped by the biases of the previous success. So they're not imprisoned by their own success, which is what the big companies are dealing with. So I would look outside, but of course the thing is that the failure rate of startups is abysmal. I mean, it's huge. So it's very hard to predict who would be the dominant one. But we have to look at the big players because they've got money to spend and they'll make some progress. But they are unlikely to be the ones to actually dominate and succeed at that level. What have I seen in the past year? There's been, actually, one interesting thing is, which I haven't actually seen, but the new Apple iPhone 12 has LiDAR in it. All right, so they built in LiDAR, which is one of the essential things that you need for doing the scanning of the world. So to remind listeners who may not know, the Mirrorworld is this idea that you have a smart glasses that are clear. You look through them and you see the world as it is, but there's a layer of visual representation of a digital layer that shows a digital twin that shows the same world, but a digital version of it. So I'm looking at this sofa here, and I would see the real sofa, but I would see a digital version of it overlaid if I wanted to. It could appear, disappear, or I could see as much as I wanted to. And there could be other kinds of information annotated on top of that. The advantage of that, of seeing these magic smart glasses that could see this real world and layered on top of this digital twin, we call it, because it's a mirror. It's a digital mirror of that world, the same scale and in the same position. So you have an entire world that's the same, but it's a virtual one, layered on top of the real world. And what you can do with that is all kinds of things. Like you could have completely virtual things appear in that room next to that sofa, because the system knows where that sofa is and knows what your room looks like, and so it's going to render this virtual chair next to it, and you can move it around, and it would look, for all intents, like it really was there. It would have a sense of presence at the right scale and maybe even the right lighting. And so that's all being done because as you look at this world, you're also scanning it and rescanning it. So you're both generating the value, you're generating the thing while you're using it. And that is the genius of these networks. And that's, by the way, how Google makes its money. Google, this search results come from the fact that previous people searching for things would click on certain links, and those links would be the ones that would get heavier weight. They would link to them later on. And so the thing that Google delivered was actually generated by people using it.
So we'll be helping create a similar generation of the world with our LiDAR and our iPhones.
Exactly. Right. So the act of using this is also generating increasing the value of it for others.
Yeah.
That is the genius of these network effects, and that's the reason why the Mirrorworld is going to work. And that's the answer to the question, well, who's going to scan the world? The answer is you are.
Yeah.
As you're using it, you're going to be doing the work and making the value of it. And so this is one of the reasons why it doesn't take an existing platform giant to do it, because the platform will self-organize very, very quickly anew.
Yeah.
And yes, this and you know, for me, the answer to what comes after the smartphone are these smart glasses, and don't hold your breath. It's probably 10 years, 15 years, 20 years away. So the little things that we're seeing now, like Apple putting LiDAR scanners into their phones, is going to be incremental. It'll be a long way. Who knows when Apple releases their smart glasses? You know, I wouldn't be surprised if it was as far as 3 or 4 years away. Mm-hmm. Because it has to be real. It's really hard. It's difficult to do. And so so while I think the vision is, my vision, I think, is probably correct, I think it's going to be long in coming. And which is good news, because it gives us time to solve or begin to work on some of the problems that it will bring, which is issues about monitoring, surveillance, privacy, because in this world, it's a totally surveilled world. That's the only way it works. And so we have to kind of sort some of these things out.
Fascinating. What are you going to have for lunch today?
I'm thinking of tuna fish. How about you?
I have to work another 6 hours, so it'll be whatever my wife brings to my desk as I help train callers for the election in Colorado.
Yeah.
There'll be snacks. So I enjoy someone my age living as fully and embracing what's coming, because there's a bit of a tendency for people that get up to our age to think I've learned enough, but I don't see any evidence that that's a problem you're having.
I become more optimistic as I get older. I have kids, and I watch them, and that always makes, I think that's one source of optimism is, look at really young people. The older I get, the more interested in history I get, and so my optimism comes from history. And you have to be kind of blind to not acknowledge the reality of progress. I had the privilege, when I was younger, of traveling in the developing world of Asia. So there were parts of Asia that I was visiting that had not changed for hundreds of years. They were in medieval times. Places like northern Afghanistan were completely medieval cities. Cities like Kathmandu were completely pedestrians. There was no cars, no bicycles. There was cities of, maybe almost 250,000 people that without a car. And I got to witness what life was actually like in the old days. And even further into, like, say, the Himalayas, villages that had almost no metal in them. It was really like living in the 1500s. And I came away from that with a visceral sense of how much we have progressed, how real progress is. And my little rant on progress is that it's really usually only visible in hindsight, because each year we have only tiny bit of progress. We create maybe only 1% more than we destroy. Okay? Most of the world is crap. Not most, but half of the world is crap. It's terrible. It's harm. And there is only a tiny, tiny little bit more good than what we have trashed. But 1% compounded over years and years and years is civilization. So for civilization to progress and to have progress, you don't need a big delta. The delta can be so small, but it is so small that it's sometimes invisible to us. When we look around, we don't see it because it's 1%. Who can see 1%? And so that 1% compounded is only visible when we turn around and look behind us.
Yeah. All of a sudden, you've proceeded from the 15th century to now. How did that happen?
Right. So when we do that, then we can see it. So the more we look behind us from that long now vision of the last 10,000 years, we say, oh, yes, that helps us see where we're going for the next 10,000 years. That's the long now. And the long now where I'm now co-chair of the Long Now Foundation, we're doing a fundraising to try to make kind of like an endowment to help us be the long now over time. The phrase that we're using is we want to be good ancestors. How do we become a good ancestor? We, again, in civilization, have benefited so much from what previous generations have built and made.
Yeah.
They have outlasted their own lives, and we are benefiting from that. We today, I hope, should make and work on things that may not even pay off for another generation, but certainly we should be making things that will last for many generations and be good. And what else can we be doing today to be good ancestors so that in 100 years people say, hey, thank you, 2020. Thank you, people from 2020. You did that.
Right.
You were thinking of us.
Yeah.
Right? You weren't colonizing the future and taking it for yourself. You were giving us increased options.
Yeah.
And as we think about that, as I think about that, I actually am optimistic, because this is one of my bits of advice to my son, was that to be optimistic about the future, you don't need to kind of ignore the many problems that we have or that we're going to make. You only have to recognize our increased ability to solve problems. Okay.
Yeah, that's the basis.
So that's where my hope lies, is that we can get better at solving problems, and one of the ways we get better at this, it might seem trite or trivial, actually for me, is things like YouTube. I am just blown away by how the ways in which YouTube has been accelerating learning. Ways in which somebody discovers something, they make a YouTube video about what they discovered, and someone else hours later sees it and says, "Oh, I got even a better one," and they put that out, and it's around the world, and very, very fast these things innovate and expand and exfoliate, and it's just amazing. And that's just, for me, one example of the ways in which technology, even today, right now, is accelerating learning, amplifying our ability to solve problems.
I'll add a tech note aside to the work that I was doing on the campaign, and as I said, the interview took place in the midst of it. There were significant periods of time when I had finished training a group of volunteers, and then I would hang out in the Zoom room in case anybody had any trouble using the dialer. So I started taking notes on the Freewrite Traveler that I've talked to you about before. This is this very clever, comfortable keyboard that's designed strictly for first draft writing. You can't really edit much. You're just flowing your first draft out. So I was doing kind of a contemporaneous account. I called it Confessions of a Phone Bank Captain. And so by the time the day ended, I had captured quite, several hundred words about the experience in the campaign. Then I added to it on election night as I was watching the returns come in. When I downloaded the file, it gets kicked up to the web, or to the cloud, I mean. And so I was able to fetch it easily, drop it into Word. I think I dropped it actually into Scrivener, because that's another tool I'm using for my writing. And I wasn't, I thought, is this just going to be kind of lame stream of consciousness stuff that is not really suitable to put up in an essay or not? I was quite pleased with it. I mean, it seemed fresh, and the writing had an informal feel to it. It felt pretty natural. I did tighten it up quite a bit and went through as carefully as I could. But by the time, it only took maybe a half an hour, maybe an hour, for me to finalize this draft that I'd written on the Traveler. And I did publish it on Medium that night, and it's available. I'll have a link to it in the show notes. I think that might be the best way to see it, because if you just go to medium.com and search for Len Edgerly, you might run into the paywall that they have. But if you go from the link in the show notes, you should be able to read it. And that's the show for this week. And I hope I get some sleep tonight. That would be a really good idea for a long day on the road. But Darlene and I'll be sharing the driving with Tess. The Tess will be doing the bulk of the driving, because we'll be on Interstate 95 most of the way down, and we'll have a car full of supplies ready to. We won't be eating in any restaurants. We'll have a little puppy that tends to get car sick, so whoever's in the passenger seat is going to be on kind of puppy maintenance as well. And we're not too old for a good adventure as we head out in the midst of a pandemic to drive down the East Coast to Florida, and we'll hope everything goes well, and we'll keep you apprised as to our progress. I'll do the morning journal each morning, usually probably up at around 7 a.m., and you can listen to that at if you just tell your Alexa device to enable morning journal. It has changed now. It used to be able to say, Alexa, what's new? And it would play the morning journal if you've enabled it. But they now have sort of a news bundle that they're pushing. So I have found that if you say, Alexa, what's up? Then you'll get to the flash briefing, or you can say, Alexa, what's my flash briefing? But either way, if you would like to follow along on our trip to Florida, you'll get an update each morning, except Sundays, from the road at the Morning Journal. You can probably tell I'm a little excited here, but plus I have a to-do list of a mile long here that stands between here and stepping into the car and setting the go for our destination in Delaware. Thanks for listening. Hope you have a great day. Bye.